In the time we have tonight, our focus will be on Teilhard de Chardin as a 20th century Galileo. We'll leave time at the end for questions, which we welcome. E pur si muove is what Galileo is supposed to have uttered after he had caved into the Inquisition by accepting church teaching over his scientific certainty. The Italian phrase is translated as, "and yet it moves." What did this mean to Galileo and to Teilhard? Up to the 1600s, it was accepted as fact that the Earth was the center of the universe, with the sun circling the Earth every 24 hours. Simple observation and common sense said so. But Galileo Galilei came along and verified the novel theory of Copernicus that the Earth rotates around the sun, which Galileo justified by observations made with his newly invented telescope, observations that could not be made with the naked eye. Catholic doctrine, however, declared otherwise. Galileo was called up before the Inquisition, which in 1616 ruled that heliocentrism, the sun being at the center, to be a foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. For our story here at Holy Trinity Parish, it's a nice touch that it was a Jesuit, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who delivered the verdict to Galileo and demanded he recant. Galileo is called to Bellarmine's residence and told to abandon completely the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and the earth moves, and henceforth not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatever, either orally or in writing. This language will become quite familiar to Teilhard at a certain point. Galileo eventually accepts the Inquisition verdict, recanting his position and accepting home confinement for life over losing his life, but he was reputed to have muttered afterwards, "E pur si muove," and yet it moves, the earth moves, in effect saying, I can be forced to say one thing, but the truth still holds. Teilhard de Chardin had an affinity for that phrase, "E pur si muove." It shows up in half a dozen of his essays, on occasion even applying it to himself when writing letters to friends. You're aware, I know, that Mary and I are producing a television program on the life of Teilhard, which is now in the editing stage. Our working title is Rediscovering Fire, the Evolution of Teilhard de Chardin. And here's how we describe the program for public television consumption. An early 20th century French Jesuit priest and scientist, in relentless pursuit of the everlasting on earth, encounters fame, love, and implacable opposition from his church. Despite exile and lifelong censorship, his transformational insights into science and faith leave a prophetic legacy for our technological age. Our story tells the saga of how a pious boy who was secretly searching for ultimate security becomes transformed into a Jesuit, well-trained in critical thinking, with a passion for the earth and a penchant for the mystical, who finally finds the key to that security he sought so unrelentingly, finds it in a very personal understanding of evolution, and how his exhilaration and promotion of that concept of evolution leads to his own Jesuit Inquisition, giving him a special understanding of Galileo in that private comment, but it still moves. Tonight, in good Jesuit tradition, our plan is to do three things. One, highlight 4 key moments in Teilhard's life story. 2, talk about some of the little miracles we've personally experienced in making this documentary. And 3, to briefly draw the comparison between Galileo and Teilhard.
So we start with his life story. What do we know about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin? Apart from the fact that he was 4th of 11 children, he's the one on the far left, and that his great-great-grandmother was an aunt of Voltaire. We know that throughout his career, he had many admirers. Plenty of contemporaneous testimonials describe him as an adult. Here are just a very few. Pierre Teilhard was a lean patrician priest, wrote one, a jagged-visaged aristocrat, rough cast in bronze. He had a striking face and dark, penetrating gaze. There was a lively twinkle in his eye, wrote another. Humor too, but no hint of irony. On subjects that moved him, he spoke with vivacity and animation. He was a fascinating talker. His words went straight to your soul. That Teilhard was a passionate man is evident in his language. He frequently exhorted himself and others to have zest for life. The image of fire was also big in his writings. The world gradually caught fire for me, burst into flames. This happened all during my life until it formed a great luminous mass, lit from within, that surrounded me. As much as he was a scientist, he was also a poet and a mystic, writing in one letter, "This is what I have learned from my contact with the earth, the diaphany of the divine at the heart of a glowing universe, the divine radiating from the depths of matter aflame." No wonder most people think of Teilhard de Chardin as an inspired religious philosopher, and that's not incorrect. Witness his most famous books, The Divine Milieu and The Phenomenon of Man, the new title of which for a revised translation is The Human Phenomenon. But 11 volumes of purely scientific writings demonstrate that he was also a world-class geologist and paleontologist, what we call a down-in-the-dirt geologist explorer, a sort of clerical Indiana Jones. Based on the large number of his inspiring quotes like these to be found on the internet, you'd think that his life was one continuous inspiration, and you probably have your own favorite quotes. But in fact, Teilhard's life story is one of continuous struggle. Internal struggles that started very early, struggle with a learned tension between love of the world and love of God that finally erupted in his great aha about evolution. Physical and psychological struggles facing imminent death during 67 battles over 4.5 years in World War I, the catalyst for his spiritual essays refined over a lifetime. Struggles of obedience with his Jesuit authorities, the Galileo struggle, and a lifelong struggle to make sense of life and of divine and human love, including the Lucille Swan story.
And this struggle is the focus of the fascinating story that Mary and I have set out to tell in our television biography, destined for public television. From the beginning, we knew that we wanted to offer more than a recitation of the facts of his life. A couple of excellent French filmmakers had already done that. We wanted to capture the drama of his life, his struggles and triumphs that biographers so seldom talk about. We should point out that we are not aiming this program at a Catholic audience, although Catholics may have a particular interest. Throughout his career, Teilhard was at ease with scientific colleagues and others who were non-believers. And in that spirit, we want to tell his story to a wide audience in language that does not presume Christian commitment or belief in God. We think that the drama of his life is enough to hold the interest of viewers and lead them to further investigation of his ideas in other venues, including our own website.
Any major documentary is a complex undertaking. It requires thoroughly researching the story and figuring out how to tell it. It means raising substantial funding. It involves seeking out and engaging numerous experts. It demands a host of logistical challenges. Making this particular documentary has been an adventure. It has created its own story, overflowing with serendipity, or depending on your point of view, a host of little miracles. We quite frankly had no idea just how interesting a life Teilhard had when we started, nor what we would turn up as we proceeded.
So we started with what we had on hand. 2 Georgetown University libraries have valuable Teilhard collections, we discovered. The Special Collections Library has extensive collections of Teilhard's letters and original essays, and the Woodstock Theological Library has other collections, including the Schmitz-Moorman collection of his scientific research. Also at Georgetown were 2 leading Teilhard scholars, John Haught and Elia Delio, who were the very first ones we went to for guidance. While we're mentioning leading scholars who we talked to early, though we should also mention Ursula King, whose book Spirit of Fire we consider to be the best biography of Teilhard in English. And by the way, we owe a great deal to Georgetown University President Jack DeGioia, who provided strong personal and university support from the beginning, including hosting a 2015 seminar on the relevance of Teilhard to the world today. So here's an early bit of the serendipity we ran into. Among other people we consulted was Father Jim Salmon, a Baltimore Jesuit who was well-versed in Teilhard. He brought to our meeting Nicole Schmitz-Moorman, who with her late husband Carl had edited all of Teilhard's scientific works in the 11 volumes you just saw. Nicole, French by birth, had also spent years transcribing Teilhard's tiny handwriting in the journal that he had kept throughout his life. Nicole, who was extremely knowledgeable about Teilhard, was instantly on board with our project, and her collaboration has been invaluable in the scripting of this show. At the same time, we caught an early break that arose from doing research in the Special Collections Library at Georgetown. I wanted to make copies of very interesting letters I found there, initially just for research purposes. I was told that before I could do that, I would need permission of the Teilhard family in France. I was given an email address from Marie Bayon de Latour, a great niece of Teilhard, who is also the executive director of the Teilhard Family Association in Paris. We wrote to Marie, sent her a summary of our proposed documentary, and asked for permission to copy documents for research purposes. For several months, we heard nothing. In the meantime, we had met John Grimm, the president of the American Teilhard Association, in a conference in California, and a few months later attended an American Teilhard Association meeting in New York. There, John introduced us to a woman named Tracy Higgins. Tracy had lived in Paris for a number of years and had gotten to know the Teilhard family. Tracy and we hit it off, and she wanted to be part of the project as well. Now comes the first little miracle. A few days after that meeting, we finally got an email response from Marie Bayon de Latour. She had circulated our proposal, she wrote, to her family members, and they had decided that yes, they would cooperate with our project. They only had one condition. They wanted us to agree to work closely with a woman they knew in the US named Tracy Higgins. And as we go on, you'll see how essential this became. Let's start the screen share again.
The struggles in Teilhard's life started very early as he was growing up in the mountainous region of France called Auvergne. Decades later, in his autobiographical essay, The Heart of Matter, he describes his first memory. I was 5 or 6, he writes. He was sitting near the fireplace that warmed the room. My mother had snipped off a few of my curls. I picked one up and held it close to the fire. The hair was burnt up in a fraction of a second, and a terrible grief assailed me. I had learned that I was perishable. So what did he do? He started searching for things he thought were non-perishable, especially items made of iron. In secrecy and silence, I withdrew into the secret contemplation, the possession of my iron god, he wrote. With a plow hitch, I believed myself at 7 years, rich with a treasure incorruptible, everlasting. And then it turned out that what I possessed was just a bit of iron that rusted. At this discovery, I threw myself on the lawn and shed the bitterest tears of my existence. Can you imagine that the 5-year-old in this picture could have had such advanced awareness? The seeds of a mystic were present in him very early. And so while still a child, Teilhard launched a lifetime of searching for the indestructible, the lasting, the permanent, the holy grail sought by this clerical Indiana Jones. This was the time in Teilhard's life when he was homeschooled by his mother in religion and by his father in studying nature. It was the time about which Teilhard wrote, Auvergne molded me. Auvergne gave me my first taste of the joys of discovery. To Auvergne, I owe my delight in nature. So it was that from his childhood, Teilhard had felt a deep love of the earth. The opening lines of his first major essay that he will write on the front during the war are these. I write these lines to express a passionate vision of the earth and to search for a solution to the doubts of my activity, because I love the universe, its energies, its secrets, its hopes, and because at the same time I am devoted to God, the only origin, the only end. What are the doubts of his activity for which he seeks a solution? As a young Jesuit in training, his passion for the earth was so strong that he wondered if he was giving God his due and whether he needed to give up his geological passions to focus only on God. This became the second phase of interior struggle in young Pierre's life. You might wonder why he felt this tension so fiercely, but you have to realize that he had been formed as a young Jesuit by the spiritual teachings of Thomas à Kempis, who wrote a classic treatise called The Imitation of Christ that all new Jesuits were required to read and reread. This is Teilhard's actual copy. À Kempis taught that to become holy, we must turn away from the world. This is the greatest wisdom, to seek the kingdom of heaven through contempt of the world. You can readily see that contempt of the world is a far cry from Teilhard's love of the universe, its energies, its secrets, its hopes. A spiritual director assures Teilhard that he can find and love God through the earth, and that he did not need to be afraid of that passion. Still, this tension wears at him for some years until he arrives at his big aha of evolution. Then he comes to understand that everything in the cosmos is constantly emerging, becoming something new. The word he used is Genesis. God he saw is present in everything and is in fact the very energy of evolution. God is working through evolution in the creation of everything, what Teilhard called cosmogenesis. Teilhard would later write, There is a communion with God, and there is a communion with earth, and there is a communion with God through the earth. Nothing in this world, he concluded, is profane to those who have the eyes to see.
Now, Mary and I really felt we had to get the story of Teilhard's childhood and youthful formation right. But without actually seeing the house that he grew up in, or the mountains and valleys he roamed in, it was hard to imagine how to treat this visually on film. Thank goodness we had a special resource, Marie Bayon de la Tour. We had struck up a correspondence with Marie after she agreed to our research request. I understood school book French, but had not learned it as a spoken language. So I wrote to her in English and she wrote to me in French. Marie soon followed up with a suggestion. To fully understand her great uncle Pierre Teilhard, meaning Father Teilhard, it would really be necessary, she said, to walk in his footsteps. And to that end, she offered to host us on a visit to the Auvergne region in France, where the young Pierre had grown up. Of course, we enthusiastically said yes, even with the awareness that we were hardly in any financial position to do so just yet. This was in the fall. Trusting in Providence and making a special financial appeal to our growing list of backers for help, we agreed to join her the following June. As we scurried to find funds, we awaited further direction from Marie. But several months passed without a word. We began to get anxious about where we were going, how long we would be there, and where we would stay. So we wrote to Marie and asked her where we could plan on staying while we were there. She wrote back and said we would be staying at Mirole.
So we went to Google Maps to look up Mirole. Sure enough, not far from Clermont-Ferrand, the capital city of the Auvergne region, is the small picturesque town of Mirole, tucked into steep volcanic hillsides. The tourist bureau listed only a few hotels there, as I remember, and we thought it would be wise to get Marie's advice as to which hotel would be our best bet. We soon got a letter back that surprised us and made us realize that our understanding of the nuances of her French was not near as good as we thought. And it was clear that she was upset. Her letter began, remember she wrote in French, "I am in the process of completing the program that I'm going to give you, and I am distressed by your email." She went on to say that making arrangements was far from easy for her. Whoa, this was not a good start. This was a case for our new friend, Tracy Higgins. We forwarded the email to Tracy and asked her to please telephone Marie in France and talk to her directly to help sort things out. And the next day, Tracy called back after talking to Marie.
Well, context is everything. Mirole, it turns out, is a town, yes, but it's also the name of one of the 3 chateaus that are still in the Teilhard family. And that was the Mirole that Marie was referring to. And she could not understand our ingratitude in wanting to go to a hotel, particularly since she had had to persuade the owner of her Mirole to let us come there and take pictures. It was then that Marie persuaded Tracy to accompany us on our trip to France to act as translator and intercultural buffer. Now, Marie's uncle Régis Teilhard de Chardin, Pierre Teilhard's nephew, was a very gracious host when we were at Mirole, and we got along famously despite the fact that he spoke no English and our French was very limited. Mirole, we learned, had played an important part in the life of Teilhard as a young boy. It was situated on the banks of the Allier River. Those banks were covered with stones that washed down from the mountains, and young Pierre Teilhard would go there to search for special stones and to break some of them with a geologist's hammer in hopes of finding fossils. Marie took us down to the Allier to demonstrate the search that is still a strong tradition with her and her cousins in the family.
A second family chateau is named Les Moulins. Visiting there was easier for Marie to plan since her father, Henri de Passage, Teilhard's nephew-in-law, owned the house. Henri could not have been more generous to us. What's more, he spoke English that he had learned while working for an oil company in San Francisco in his younger years. Les Moulins was the place that Teilhard went for his summer retreat and rest for a month each year in the late 1940s, between his return from China after World War II and his second exile to the US in 1950. So Henri described vivid memories of Uncle Pierre staying at the house and saying mass in the built-in chapel. The second-story room where Teilhard stayed when he was at Moulins is still preserved the way it was when Teilhard resided there. Henri was able to tell us wonderful stories of those times. Teilhard spent many hours at this desk, writing letters and essays, looking out over the Auvergne that he loved. Each morning, Henri told us, Teilhard would bring down a new sheaf of letters for Henri to drive to the post office. Henri was 90 years old when we met him, and we were able to film a marvelous sit-down formal interview with him 3 years later.
Sarsenat is the name of the family estate where Teilhard was born. Here, Teilhard's niece Isabel, who owned Sarsenat, was more cautious about letting us visit, asking us not to take photos at the time of our research visit. But just a few years later, when we returned to shoot, Isabel and her family, who were visiting for a summer vacation, could not have been more gracious. They gave us the run of the house to film. Now, in 1954, the year before he died, Teilhard had returned from New York to visit Sarsenat, accompanied by his close Jesuit friend Pierre Leroy. Leroy related later that as they walked the halls of the three-storied Sarsenat, Teilhard hardly spoke a word, absorbed in memories. But when they got to the open doorway at the end of the second floor corridor, he said, "This is the room where I was born." It was his mother's bedroom. During our visit to Auvergne, Teilhard came alive for us. Not only did we learn innumerable details that we would not find in books, but we got a sense of what he meant when he later wrote that Auvergne shaped him. The soaring arches of Clermont-Ferrand Cathedral with its hushed sounds and burning candles would have impressed his young imagination, but no more than the arching trees reaching for the heavens he relished in the world of nature. We saw the baptismal font in the little church where he was baptized as a baby and where his mother went to mass daily. As we walked the same paths the child Pierre walked in the luxuriant mountainside, we could begin to understand his passion for the earth, for the nature, for stones.
There's a family story of the time when young Teilhard, maybe 8 years old, disappeared one day in the company of his cousin Marguerite, the same age as he, whose family was visiting from Clermont-Ferrand. The two families noticed that the children were missing and after some hours became frantic in searching for them. Pierre and Marguerite, it turned out, had decided on their own to climb to the top of the volcanic mountain nearest Sarsenat, the Puy de Pariou. When we heard this story, we readily agreed to climb the mountain ourselves with Marie and Tracy, but it was not as easy as we had expected. Not only was the mountain steeper than we thought and higher, but we had not come prepared with the proper clothes, especially shoes. While Marie and Tracy wore hiking shoes, we were wearing regular street shoes, and on top of that, it rained the night before, and the muddy path was slick, particularly with our smooth soles. My shoes were particularly bad, and for every one step forward, it felt like I would slide 2 steps back. We had asked Marie and Tracy to go on ahead, and eventually we lost sight of them and knew there was no way we could turn back because Marie's plan was to return by another route. But when we finally reached the top and rejoined them, it was worth it. That's Clermont-Ferrand visible in the distance. And you can see the bowl at the top of the mountain, typical of dormant volcanoes. The day we were there, a school group was having a field trip. We don't have time in today's presentation to cover all the sites we visited, but the small miracles we referred to applied especially to 2 other places, Hastings, England, and China.
When Teilhard was still a Jesuit novice, a French secularization law caused the Jesuits to leave France, and they set up a school of theology in Hastings, England. So when the time came for Teilhard to study theology, specifically to prepare for the priesthood, he spent 4 years there and was ordained there. This was a pivotal point in his life. Hastings was an ideal place for Teilhard to pursue his interest in geology and nature. He immediately begins to explore the area and writes home, "Naturally, one of my first preoccupations was to see what the countryside had to offer. Geologically speaking, this is a lower Cretaceous area, approximately 120 million years old, marked by chalky soil, the extinction of dinosaurs, the development of early mammals and flowering plants, and I've already spotted a few fossils." Within walking distance of Teilhard Seminary were dramatic seaside cliffs that were rich with fossils. He would use every Thursday he could, Thursday was their day free of classes, exploring the rocky beach at the foot of the cliffs. The tides, very dangerous when they are high, only allowed access to the beach for limited periods. During his time in Hastings, his goal to pursue geology professionally became firm. Hastings was also a turning point in Teilhard's interior journey. Remember, he was determined to resolve that inner conflict that had arisen in his early training between his dedication to God and his passion for the earth. His passion for the earth had led him to learn all he could about evolution. Teilhard had read Darwin, but he was interested less in the evolution of species than he was in the evolution of the cosmos, from its first moment, what we now call the Big Bang, to the emergence of human consciousness and beyond. And his search for understanding was complicated by his determination to synchronize or synthesize evolution with his faith in Christ. Now, Jesuit training in the first decade of the 20th century required 3 years of theology studies leading up to priestly ordination, followed by a 4th year of theology. In his 3rd year, shortly before ordination, Teilhard experienced his big aha. He saw how everything fit together. It exhilarated him. He had found the key to the incorruptible and everlasting that he had been seeking. Teilhard saw humans as the peak of evolution, but for him, the key was understanding that all of evolution has been and is essentially the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of spirit. And as part of that insight, he realized that matter and spirit are not two things, but one. In his autobiography, years later, he would remember how this insight exhilarated him. You can well remember, quote, you can well remember how strong was my inner feeling of release and expansion when I took my first, still hesitant steps into an evolutive universe. He saw that matter and spirit were no longer two things that required a choice between them, but they were two aspects of one and the same cosmic stuff. Spirit is no means, he said, or the opposite pole of the tangible. Rather, it is its very heart. All matter, he theorized, is both matter and spirit, no matter how inert we perceive the elements to be. Everything has two aspects, both an inside and an outside. The inside is spirit, and the outside is material. And when evolution reaches the level of human life, that inner dimension of spirit becomes what we know as consciousness, which brings with it qualities of freedom and capacity for love. And with those qualities, we have become empowered as co-creators of evolution. And henceforth, we have some responsibility for it.
Obviously, Hastings was a place we knew we had to shoot. Some of you may recognize that our cinematographer in this picture is Father Eddie Siebert, who produced Holy Trinity's anniversary videos a few years ago. He was with us in most locations and is in fact our co-producer on this documentary. Unlike Auvergne, however, we were starting without a contact in Hastings. Through our friend Matt Cook, we learned of a former American Jesuit, Ed Eklund, who now lived there. I immediately wrote to him for advice, but unfortunately, Ed was going to be out of the country at the time we needed to be in Hastings for research. But he introduced us to an amateur geologist, very knowledgeable about Teilhard, who agreed to help. Not only did Ken Brooks help us book housing, he and his wife took 3 days to introduce us to the area. The most important location was the cliffs at Pet Level, where Teilhard and a fellow Jesuit would scavenge for fossils. We learned a couple of important things from Ken. As folks unschooled in geology, we always had thought that when the books said Teilhard collected fossils, he just discovered them lying on the ground. Ken set us straight. Teilhard had learned to recognize which type of rock was fossiliferous, and virtually every fossil Teilhard found there, he discovered by taking a promising stone and breaking it open. Once in a great while, that stone would yield a fossil trapped in it for some 120 million years. Some of the fossils and stones that Teilhard collected are still found in the Hastings Museum in a cigar box that Teilhard inexplicably decorated with an American flag and lined with a former theology exam paper. The other important thing we learned from Ken, no, a critical thing we learned, is that access to the cliffs is limited to a few hours each day due to the tides, and only a few of those days each month occur in daylight, which was necessary for filming. It was simply too dangerous to get trapped under the cliffs at high tide. Now, after our research trip to Hastings, it would be another 5 years before we would raise the money sufficient to return to shoot. We stayed in touch with Ken in the meantime. But when the time finally came and I wrote to Ken to coordinate schedules, we did not hear back from him. And after emailing him several times and waiting anxiously, we heard nothing. Timing had become critical because we needed to coordinate our shooting at Hastings with shooting in Paris at the National Museum of Natural History. And it turned out that the museum only allowed shooting on 2 Tuesdays a month, and national holidays that year effectively limited that to 1 Tuesday a month. While that may not seem too complicated, we had to know the tide tables in order to know on what days we could shoot in Hastings that would allow us to arrive in Paris on that single Tuesday that we could shoot there. You'd think that in this day and age, the tide tables would be on the web. They are, but only a month in advance. With time drawing short, we wrote to Ed Eklund and learned that Ken's wife had died a few months earlier, and he was so bereft that he was not able to respond. So Ed's wife drove into Hastings to buy the annual tide tables in a booklet and mailed the booklet to us, another unexpected gift. We were now in a position to plan, but we had counted so heavily on Ken's ability to make arrangements for us in Hastings that we felt like we were flying blind. With our proposed shooting period just a few months away, one day we received a totally unexpected email. A British woman wrote from England that she had read about our documentary and she was devoted to Teilhard and wanted to know anything she could to do to help us. She said that she had had some experience in previous years working in television. We, of course, wrote right back to tell her we would be shooting in Hastings, and Georgina Dean answered immediately that she lived just 40 minutes from Hastings and would be delighted to become our local production manager. Also, her husband was a geologist. If you believe in miracles, you can believe in this one. Georgina was absolutely first-rate organization and made our visit there extremely productive. Without her, we don't know how we would have pulled it off. And so I was now able to schedule a time in Hastings that would allow us to shoot also in Paris on that one Tuesday of the month it was allowed.
China is immensely significant in Teilhard's life. He spent half his adult life there. He made his first trip there in 1923 at the invitation of a fellow Jesuit, Émile Lisson. Lisson had already been excavating for fossils for almost a decade at that point and had a museum in Tientsin on the coast due east of Peking. During that year and a half of visit to China, Teilhard was in high spirits, writing frequent letters to not only Marguerite, but to his other friends in Paris. On that trip, he finished a mystical essay in the Ordos Desert he had started during the war, which he called Mass on the World. After returning to France, he would be forced to return to China, banished there by Jesuit superiors to silence his voice on the topic of evolution in the church. But instead of gaining anonymity there, he became world famous as part of the geological team that discovered Peking Man. Peking Man was the name given to a collection of the most famous early human fossils found up to that point in history, although the discoverers determined that the Peking Man fossils were really those of a female and privately called her Nellie. It was in China that Teilhard wrote both The Divine Milieu and The Human Phenomenon. Teilhard became very well known and respected internationally. He was invited on expeditions with the famous American explorer Roy Chapman Andrews, the real-life inspiration for Indiana Jones. And he joined the French team of the extraordinary Yellow Crossing going across China, sponsored by the automaker Citroën, to demonstrate all-terrain vehicles, including the predecessor of 20th century military tanks. It was also during this time that he became close friends with Lucille Swan, an American sculptor visiting China, who became responsible for sculpting the likeness of Peking Man and who became his sounding board and collaborator on The Human Phenomenon. Some 23 years of letters between Teilhard and Lucille Swan have been published. They reveal a deep and sometimes difficult relationship.
We knew that much about Teilhard's China history, but when it came to filming, we didn't know where to begin. We did have some starting points. We knew we wanted to shoot in Beijing and at Zhikudien, the site where Peking Man was discovered, and in the Ordos Desert, where Teilhard wrote Mass on the World. Georgetown University has an institution called the Beijing Center for Foreign Students to Learn Chinese. We arranged housing there. Early on in our research, we had been introduced by one of our scholars to a Chinese paleontologist who speaks English and who spends half of each year in Canada. Hai Lu Yu accepted our invitation to be on our Council of Scholars, and we timed our visit to Beijing for the window of time when he would be in China and in Beijing and not in the field. So off we went to China with at least a place to stay and someone to consult with in Beijing. Our English-speaking contact at the Beijing Center had sent us the address for our housing destination in Chinese characters that she said we should show to the taxi driver. That worked well, although when you get dropped off at the entrance to a large university after dark on a Saturday night after a 13-hour flight, it can be a challenge to find the proper building for registration. Sometime later, we managed to drag our bags up 5 flights to our room, tired but optimistic.
Hai Lu Yu is a senior researcher for the IVPP, the Institute for Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology of the Chinese Academy of Science. We had an appointment to see him on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. So after checking out the maps, both city maps and subway maps, we decided to make a trial run of that trip for the first time on Sunday, when we could avoid time pressures and could afford to get lost. We were conveniently located a 15-minute walk between two subway lines. We made our choice of subway stations and set out. To do a trial run was very smart, but Sunday traffic on the subway turned out to be nearly as bad as weekday rush hour. Although we had to change trains twice and never had to sit down, we were relieved to see that every station stop was written in English letters as well as Chinese characters. In the very modern trains, they had LED maps that always made it clear where you were. We also had the chance to learn a very valuable lesson. The crush of people getting in and off the train at each stop did not leave room for politeness. When we got to one station where we needed to change trains, I charged ahead to get off. Mary, unfortunately, was being polite and allowing people to go ahead of her. But with a push of people boarding, Mary never would have gotten off that train if I had not had hold of her wrist and literally dragged her out before the door closed.
Too true.
So,
But thanks to that adventure, we were able to be on time the next morning for our meeting with Hai Lu Yu. We were in for a surprise. In none of our conversations with Teilhard scholars, including the Teilhard family, had we learned of the immense stature Teilhard enjoys in modern-day China. Hai Lu Yu told us of the importance of Teilhard in Chinese paleontology and gave us a tour of the IVPP Museum, which displays multiple fossils discovered by Teilhard and features him in their museum story. Then he took us to meet a couple of other people. One of those was the director of the IVPP, Gao Jing. This was no mere formality, it turned out. Gao Jing had written a book about a major paleontological site in Inner Mongolia called Shuidonggu that Teilhard had discovered 90 years before. Gao Jing gave us a copy of his book and insisted that we visit the site, arranging to have a high-ranking official of the region host us there. Gao Jing then took us down the hall to meet Hu Yamei. She had a poster of Teilhard on the wall of her office that she had picked up at a conference in France. Her special area of expertise was excavations in the Ordos Desert, and she was able to set up arrangements for us to visit Salawusu. Teilhard called this place Shara Osogol, and it is famously known as the site he wrote Mass on the World. She also arranged for a high-ranking official to host us. That official was Bai Qing Yuan, who had written the history of Salawusu and who could tell us every detail of Teilhard's time there, down to the tree under which he and Émile Issant camped when they first arrived. The other person you see in the picture with Mr. Bai is our friend, Father Jerry Martinson, a Jesuit priest and television producer who lived in Taiwan for 40 years and spoke fluent Mandarin. He was our interpreter and also introduced us to Cindy Zheng, who we hired as our production manager in China when we went back to film. China was far and away the most complicated and difficult location for shooting, and fortunately for us, Cindy was another miracle worker. The IVPP also arranged a visit for us to a third location called Nihewan, which is not mentioned in most Teilhard literature, but which is today the most famous paleontological site in China, which they call the home of early man. A large bust of Teilhard overlooks the vast valley of mountainous folds of desert. But the most dramatic statement of respect for Teilhard was the first place we stopped, thanks to Gao Jing. Shuidonggu, still an active paleontological site, is being developed into a tourist attraction featuring Teilhard in part. Shuidonggu has a good story to tell about Teilhard and Issant. It is dramatized in a diorama with life-size wax statues. The story goes that after 6 weeks of travel with their caravan of donkeys on their way to the Ordos and sleeping all that time in the open air, Teilhard and Issant happened late one evening upon a small inn for travelers. They gratefully took advantage of the hospitality that was offered. In the light of the next morning, they looked out from the inn, and 100 yards away, they saw red cliffs that almost certainly contained fossils. A closer examination proved that judgment correct, so they delayed their trip to the Ordos for a week to dig there, ending up with 16 crates of fossils. In addition to the diorama telling Teilhard's story at Shuidonggu today, there was a large bust of him in front of the reconstructed inn. This trip to China caused us to shift our emphasis on Teilhard's life to give greater prominence to both his scientific work and to his life in China.
The last key moment in Teilhard's life that we'll touch on is his Galileo moment, the crisis of obedience that would totally change the arc of his life. It would test his self-identity and would create unforeseen opportunities. This drama occurred at roughly the midpoint of Teilhard's life. He had entered the Jesuits as a teenager, had his great epiphany regarding evolution, and been ordained by age 30. He spent 2 years doing geology studies before he was called up to military service, which lasted 4.5 years. After the war, he completed his doctorate in geology to great acclaim. He was now a shooting star in his scientific field. At the age of 40, he was named professor of geology at the Institut Catholique in Paris. We knew we needed to shoot there. We were well received at the Institute and were given access to documents and letters by and about Teilhard that were to help us understand the depth of drama that would soon transform his life. As a young professor, Teilhard was very popular with students. He also attended intellectual salons to which he was frequently invited thanks to his cousin Marguerite. She was his childhood companion with whom he had hiked up the Puy de Paris. Marguerite was now headmistress of an exclusive girls' school in Paris, and before the war had introduced her cousin to the intellectual life of Paris. He was an enthusiastic apostle of evolution and of what the understanding of evolution can do to open up our horizons and worldview. This sculpted depiction of Adam and Eve and the serpent is one that young Teilhard would have seen on winter Sundays if he were to look up from his pew in Clermont-Ferrand. Who knows how it affected him? But Adam and Eve became important later in his life. While the young Jesuits in training loved Teilhard, he was not so popular among some older Jesuits. One day, after delivering a lecture to Jesuits studying theology in Belgium, a faculty member present had a question for him. "If what you say about evolution is true, Father," he said, "then it would seem that there never was a Garden of Eden or Adam and Eve. And if that is true, what happens to the church's doctrine on original sin?" Teilhard had already given some thought to this issue. 2 years earlier, he'd actually written a personal essay on the question. So he was able to respond to Father Riedinger on the spot, reframing original sin in the light of scientific thinking. But he wasn't fully satisfied with his answer, and so he said he would give it further thought and would write a paper about it. It had been Teilhard's mode of operation for years and would continue to be until his death, that when he wanted to think through something, he would write a paper about it. In this case, he came up with 3 alternative ways of thinking about original sin, which he planned to send to a couple of trusted Jesuit friends for their reaction. In the meantime, this is 1922 we're talking about, he had accepted the offer he'd earlier received from Émile Lisson in China to accompany him on a paleontological expedition there. He believed it would be a good experience to inform his teaching, and he also felt the time was right because he was feeling the heat from older Jesuits opposed to evolution, and it was good to get out of their line of fire. He finished his essay before he left for China, put it in his desk drawer, and set sail. That proved to be a serious mistake. A year and a half later, Teilhard was aboard a ship sailing back to France. The Jesuit Father General in Rome, Vladimir Letohovsky, was composing a letter to Teilhard's provincial superior, Father Costa de Beauregard. "I am writing about a serious matter with regard to Father Teilhard de Chardin," it begins. He explains that he has received from an unknown source a paper explaining original sin in the light of modern science, unsigned, but attributed to Father Teilhard. He's had the paper reviewed by theologians at the Gregorian, who condemn it as not conforming to accepted church doctrine. So he gives directions to Father Costa de Beauregard. Number 1, Father Teilhard is to be given the chance to deny that he wrote the paper. It would be a real relief, quote, "It would be a real relief to learn that the memoir on original sin was not written by one of us," unquote. Number 2, if he did write it, he must promise in writing to never write anything against church teaching again. And 3, if Teilhard's explanations are not satisfactory, the general will be obliged to take necessary measures to avoid such regrettable deviations in the future, which could include expulsion from the Society of Jesus. Teilhard is barely back in Paris at the Institut Catholique when he's summoned by his provincial superior to his headquarters in Lyon. There, Teilhard is presented with the general's ultimatums.
Teilhard is devastated. He cannot in good conscience deny the science of evolution. He had written his original sin essay in good faith, not to reject church doctrine, but rather to preserve it by looking at it with the fresh eyes of evolutionary awareness. He did not consider himself a professional theologian, and certainly the Jesuits did not, but he thought he had useful and important insights that would help theologians find continuity with established doctrine while informing it with scientific findings. Now, as a Jesuit with final vows, which he had taken just before the Great War, Teilhard had not only taken a vow of obedience, but had always aspired to the ideal of perfect obedience. But since the days of Ignatius himself, perfect obedience was not understood as blind obedience. It encouraged the subject to make representation to authority to clarify and or modify the orders given in obedience. This gives Teilhard some daylight for negotiation. He makes the case to his provincial that he had never intended his paper for publication, but had written it only as a draft stating some hypotheses and only as a starting point for discussions between a few theologians. He seeks to soften the orders he's been given by proposing an alternative. He had intended only to demonstrate that original sin could be reconciled with the data of modern science, he says. And henceforth, he proposes he would limit such speculations to conversations with professional theologians. Father Costa is skeptical that this will do, but agrees to send this proposal to the general in Rome. In a few weeks, the general writes back. He admires the provincial, he writes, for defending Father Teilhard and noting that he is a good priest and well-intentioned. But that is not what I asked of you, the general continues. I asked very specific things. He goes on to say that the consequence of obstinance on the part of Teilhard will be to dismiss him from the Society of Jesus and to denounce him to the Holy Office. And he now provides 6 specific statements Teilhard is required to sign. All but one of these are statements from the Council of Trent. 3 of them state the understanding of original sin as an inherited sin. 1 states that faith is superior to reason, and 1 says that dogma can never change. All of these are things Teilhard believes he can rationalize enough to sign, but number 4 is a real obstacle in his mind. It states that the whole human race takes its origin from one proto-parent, Adam. Teilhard knows this is impossible in the eyes of science, and to sign it would be dishonest, and he also believes it stands outside of theological competence.
In his agony, Teilhard turns to friends, both Jesuit and non-Jesuit. "Oh, my friend," he writes to his closest Jesuit friend, Valentin, "help me. If I show defiance, I will betray my fundamental faith in the fact that everything that happens to me is animated by God. I'll compromise the religious value of my ideas. I'll be accused of spite, estrangement from the church, and who knows what else. But if he does not hold tight to his principles, might not that be worse? Which," he cries, "is the more sacred of my vocations? The one that I followed as a boy of 18, or my real vocation, which I discovered when I was a man? How can I obey this order without making myself the victim of the very formalism I've always stood against? Tell me, my friend, that it would not be wrong for me to yield to the orders of my superiors." The advice that comes back to him from his friends runs the gamut. His mentor at the Museum of Natural History, Marcelin Boule, says this only proves that no one can be both a believer and a scientist. His good friend and fellow priest geologist, Abbe Broyle, says, "You're in a bad marriage, get a divorce." Some others suggest that you leave the Jesuits to become a diocesan priest. Some Jesuits counsel just sign the document. Valentin counsels sign the document with mental reservation as an act of obedience, but not as an act of intellectual assent. Teilhard's hesitance in signing causes further action on the part of his superiors. They now withdraw him from teaching at the Independent Institut Catholique over the objections of his bishop rector, who makes a strong case for Teilhard's integrity as a priest and a teacher. But the general wants him gone from France and, quote, missions him, that is, exiles him indefinitely to China, conceding only that he can finish his semester of teaching so as not to, quote, scandalize the educational community. With the stakes now well defined, Teilhard leaves Paris to make an 8-day retreat to discern in Ignatian tradition what God asks of him.
By the way, this trial that Teilhard was experiencing was taking place the very same month that a man named John Scopes was on trial in Dayton, Tennessee for the crime of teaching evolution in a public school. 6 months after he is first summoned to Lyon, Teilhard signs the required document and sends a letter of obeisance to Father General Ledahusky. Ledahusky writes back that even mere hypotheses must be rejected a priori when they contradict dogma. He expresses sympathy for Teilhard's suffering, but states, quote, "I had to act because my duty was very clear and I did not have the right to let you continue in a dangerous direction, not only for the honor of the society, but for the good of souls, of yours in particular," unquote. Teilhard is allowed 6 months to wrap up his affairs before sailing from Marseille for good in the spring of 1926. Of course, it is a great irony that within 3 years, Teilhard would be a member of a Chinese geological team responsible for the discovery of Peking Man. And Teilhard would be propelled into an international celebrity, traveling the world to explain the significance of Peking Man and of evolution. Teilhard will remain in China for a total of 23 years. He is finally forced to leave there by the Chinese after World War II, and so is allowed to return to France. He expects to be allowed to return to teaching, and he is in fact celebrated by the scientific establishment in France. He gives many lectures, including a series of 5 at the Sorbonne, and is asked to accept the geology chair at the Collège de France. He is inducted into the Institut de France and is nominated to the very exclusive French Academy of Sciences, but he must get permission for that last appointment, which permission is denied. In 1950, Teilhard accepts an invitation to join his colleague George Barber on a visit to South Africa, the new center of world paleontological activity. But his health is frail. He had had a debilitating attack of pleurisy the previous year, and 2 years before that had suffered a heart attack, requiring a long convalescence. Now his local superior in Paris fears that he will not survive the trip and insists that before he leaves the country, he must bequeath all his papers to a layperson to take them out of the hands of the Jesuits, who he fears would destroy them. Teilhard consults with a canon lawyer to ease his discomfort with this, but then writes a brief note to his voluntary secretary, Jean Mortier, leaving all the documents to her. After a challenging trip to South Africa, Teilhard goes directly to New York to live, where he is employed by the Wenner-Gren Foundation, a paleontological research organization. A few years later, on Easter Sunday, 1955, he suffers a second heart attack and dies. Jean Mortier immediately takes Teilhard's papers to a French publisher.
After a hurried funeral with only a dozen people present, he is taken to the Jesuit novitiate in Hyde Park, New York, to be buried. The April earth there is too frozen to allow immediate burial, and he's placed in a temporary crypt in the chapel. When the ground thaws, he is interred without ceremony. His name on the tombstone is initially misspelled. So we end as we began. Eppur si muove, still it moves. As with Galileo 300 years before, pursuit of science had led Teilhard to a momentous insight, which the hierarchical church found threatening. Their cases have similarities. Both Galileo and Teilhard were focused on the earth. For Galileo, it was verifying that the earth was in motion around the sun. For Teilhard, it was that the earth and the whole cosmos is still coming to birth. Neither set out to threaten the church, but Galileo's writing nevertheless threatened the power of the popes by indicating that not only are we not the center of the cosmos, but truth about the universe is not fixed and absolute. Teilhard, without seeking to, threatened the power of the church by putting in motion a new examination of scripture and tradition based on the scientific realization that we do not live in a static universe, but a dynamic one. Galileo was condemned and sentenced to home imprisonment. He conceded to home church authority, but privately stuck to his understanding, stating, but still it moves. Teilhard was condemned and sent into exile, where he worked all the harder to convince the church that he had found in science a pearl of great price, if only they would see it. But still it moves. Teilhard received an apology. Galileo received an apology 300 years later. Teilhard may eventually get a sort of apology in less time than that.
We've shared with you a few of the critical moments in Teilhard's life, along with some challenges in the making of our film, with moments of serendipity or miracles to overcome them. There's always more to tell, of course, but I think that is best done by answering any questions you may have. While Pam and Dennis get your questions organized, we can tell you where we are in our production. First, let me say we are grateful for the financial and moral support of more than 225 donors to this project, and that includes a number of you on this Zoom. We have finished 40 days of international shooting and most of the 20 or so interviews of experts who help us tell the story. We've acquired almost 200 hours of footage and 800 pages of interview transcripts in 3 languages and have begun the time-intensive post-production process, which includes not only editing, but researching and acquiring archival footage, casting and recording character voices and narration, sound design and sound mix, music score composition, color correction, and technical requirements for broadcast. As you know and realize, again, listening to this presentation, TV production is not a solitary exercise, and we value and appreciate the dozens of partners who have contributed to this effort. So Pam and Dennis, are there questions?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
The first question to come in was, why was Teilhard such a threat to the Jesuits and the church? I know you've spoken something about that, but could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, but if there are theologians and historians here that think I'm not quite accurate, I hope you find a way to correct me a little. So here's my take on it. It was a threat because the doctrine of original sin is so fundamental to the way the church operated and still operates today. If you stop and think about it, original sin made all of us sinners, and the only way to get out of the sin was through baptism and then confession and then and the sacraments that the church controlled. And in fact, they sold you indulgences so that you could get a little edge. So everything that the church did for centuries, as far as I'm concerned, somehow had to do with authority or control. And this was a transitional time at the beginning of the 20th century when all kinds of things were changing. But certainly the notion that the church was not going to be in control was a major issue. And it all sprang from the theological principle, in a sense, of original sin. So now Teilhard figured out a way to still keep original sin in the light of science. Science said that no, Adam and Eve were mythological characters. And in fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, but in the Protestant world, they were beginning to understand better that the genres of the Bible, and they were not so averse mostly. And that's not really true, I guess. Our fundamentalists still require that the Bible be literally correct. But the Genesis is a story that tells a very important truth, but not as history. And that misreading of history is really what has caused the problem. And even Teilhard in his 3 points, in his 3 options that he derives, is loath to get too far from the suggestion that that the Genesis is not literally true. But he can't accept it as literally true because science says it's not literally true. But that doesn't make a difference if you understand Genesis to be a story, a creation story, that it tells a truth without being history.
Thank you very much. That answers a couple of other questions as well. And that leads logically into this one, that talking about Pope Francis citing Teilhard in Laudato Si. And Teilhard's really become kind of a watchword in the environmental movement. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So you're right, in the Laudato Si and footnote 53, if you want to check it out, Pope Francis cites Teilhard along, with 4 previous popes. That basically is the point that we are all one in the universe, and we all have responsibility for the universe. This relates to what I said at one point in the presentation, that we have become co-creators of evolution. We are now responsible for the world, particularly for this planet. And Teilhard was one of the first to begin to make that point. He did not really develop that point fully. and a priest named Thomas Berry that took that point and developed it into a very robust ecological movement today. But Teilhard was at the origin of that through his union of all things.
Great, thank you. I remember when the word stewardship was in play, and it seems to be coming back now. You want to talk about, yeah.
Well, one quickie here, Frank
Yeah.
and Mary. This is an expensive proposition here. You filmed in France and England and China, all over the world, it seems like. My question is, how much more money do you need to finish this film? The last part of the film is very critical, I would think, with the editing, with all the other voices, things like that. What is left to be raised here?
That's your question.
Oh, that's my question. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dennis. Well, we need about $600,000, and because money at the end is a big chunk that all goes out to other people. So
It may seem like a lot, but it's a $1.5 million project for a two-hour broadcast.
Yeah. So that's where we are, and we looking for the funding through foundations that fund public television, also Catholic foundations, family foundations, individual donors, even small contributions. They all add up, and so
That's a big chunk. I would say that we talked about it in the course of telling our story of making it to this point, that we would do a research, and then we'd wait until we raised the money to shoot it and so on. We could pause long enough to raise more money to go do the next step. We're really at the point in post-production that there are so many things that have to happen and need to happen in rapid succession that and you can't hire an editor for a couple of weeks and say, come back and take a break and then come back 3 months from now and we'll be in a better position. So we need to get a chunk of money to be editing this, and we have some. We've gotten some very generous donations in that regard, but that's why it's so expensive in this next stage.
Frank and Mary, how if people want to donate, how do they go about doing that?
if you go to our website, which is teilhardproject.com, and there is a place to click on donate, and it takes you to a variety of places that people can send money directly to the project, or we also have availability thanks to Georgetown University. They have set up a fund for tax deductible donations, and also women in film and video. So there are a variety of ways to do that. So I think Jim is going to post that website address again at the end of this program.
Great. Two questions. One is a comment rather than a question, and then a question at the end. Given the fact that the Vatican in the early 1960s warned that the Catholic faithful about Teilhard's writings, one viewer comments, my years at Georgetown were bracketed by the council, and by then he was a hero. Wilfred Dixon in the philosophy department, apologies if I mispronounce that, had an honors course in philosophical psychology that basically used Phenomenon of Man as a seminar text. How did that transition occur that quickly is the question. Could you comment on that?
Oh, that's a delicious question, actually.
You get that, Pat Towel. I hope he didn't mind my using his name. Thanks, Pat.
I myself was a young Jesuit in the early 1960s. And when the Monotum came out in 1962, it told seminary rectors or people directing seminaries not to let seminarians read the works of Teilhard. And so, of course, we all did. That's how this whole project got started, in a sense. But that transition away from it was a Monotum. It was as a warning. And it was also, the warning came right at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. And so you had, at the same time, you had a lot of influence, ironically, of Teilhard in the Second Vatican Council, not necessarily directly himself, but through others that he influenced in the French Church and theologians. I believe that Father Ratzinger, who was a Parishioner at the time, was a believer in the position of Teilhard, and the big change in that was engaging the world as opposed to avoiding and escaping the world. So basically, it was not taken all that seriously. Is basically so the real question is it still in effect? Because basically it was ignored for a tremendously long time. Back in about 10 years ago, Federico Lombardi, who was the Pope's spokesman, said that nobody anymore can believe that can take seriously the monotum. So it gradually became ignored. But then a few years ago, the Pontifical Council on Culture decided that it needed to be formally revoked, and they wrote a letter. They by unanimous vote decided to send a letter to Pope Francis asking that the monotum be revoked. Pope Francis has not taken any action on that yet. But it's been a very gradual being honored in the breach. I don't know how to be more precise about how somebody could be teaching this at Georgetown back when it was still kind of fresh. But apparently the administration at Georgetown was not going to quarrel with that professor.
Thankfully. So you said that the relationship between Teilhard and Lucille Swan was difficult. Do you want to expand on that a little more? Was he true to his vow of celibacy?
Yeah. So for those of you who are not so familiar with Lucille Swan, Lucille Swan was a woman who came to China in 1939, running away from a divorce, and she came to Peking, and there was this big community of expats there, including Teilhard. And one night at a party, she asked him, as she says in her introduction, what kind of an ologist he is. And rather than answering her question, he went on to talk about how God is present in everything. She was a fallen away Episcopalian, but she was quite taken by his vision of the divine in the earth. And so they talked for the rest of the evening, and she stayed on in Peking, and they became very close friends. Over time, he would finish work each afternoon and would go to her house for tea, and they would discuss many things. And when he was writing the Human Phenomenon, she would be his sounding board and would argue with him. She had no trouble arguing, apparently, and she did what he didn't have an opportunity for peer review in the things he was writing, but she provided a sounding board that gave a lot of pushback. So and then she ended up, I guess this is a very, back then it was a typical thing for a woman to do. She typed his manuscript.
Amen.
So she typed up his manuscript, but she did more. She was more than a typist. She was also a collaborator, and he used to write to her in his letters and call it our baby, because it was something that emerged from their time together. So when we saw the book and we learned about Lucille at about when we were beginning this project, and we're a little nervous because we had this relationship with Marie Bayon de la Tour. So when I had a chance to speak to Marie, I wanted to test the waters. I didn't want to run into a buzzsaw asking for censorship and what we were doing. So I mentioned that we were going to have to deal with his love relationship with Lucille Swan in this documentary. And she said, "Oh, well, there are more women than that in his life." It turns out that, in fact, there were a number of very close personal relationships, female relationships in his life. The very first was his cousin Marguerite. Teilhard wrote in his autobiography that when he was 30, he discovered love. That was the year he went to Paris after he was ordained and got reacquainted with Marguerite. And Marguerite was very, very important in his life. And during the war, he wrote her hundreds of letters, and she was his rock. And so it became Marguerite was another one. So there are other women in his life. Was he faithful to his vows of celibacy? There's absolutely no doubt. Lucille insists on it. That was a source of great tension for them. She wanted more from him than just an intellectual or platonic relationship, and she said so. And he said, "Well, no, I have to be." She said, "You say that everything is sacred." So, and he said, "Yes, but I need to be me." And he would took a position that not easy for her to accept, that in loving him, she was actually not unconsciously loving God, searching for love of God, and that did not sit well. They when World War II came in China, they'd been together almost 10 years. She went off, and they stayed in touch the rest of their lives, but it was never close again. Very poignant. I have to say that we find that relationship to be not only not scandalous, but we find it a beautiful, poignant relationship. Intimacy is something that priests need, and he had the ability to have intimacy and to be unashamed of that. And I think he's actually a model priest in that regard.
A man ahead of his time in so many ways. It's just amazing. And I think this is the final question here. When did the church finally change its mind and allow theologians and scripture scholars to study the Genesis creation account in an effort to understand that account in the context of modern science and more recent scripture scholarship?
Wow, that's beyond my competence. I would say that there were theologians way back in Teilhard's day who were beginning to think that way. There was that kind of biblical scholarship was beginning back then, but by the time you got to Pope Pius XII, it was very, very cautious about allowing scriptural scholarship. There are people on this Zoom who I wish we could tap because they know the answer to your question, but I don't.
Thank you. Well, this has been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful evening. I don't know if Linda is still with us, but in any case. Okay, good.
Yes,
you want to have some final
unfortunately,
thoughts?
Yes, I would love to have a final thought. I've been a little bit in and out just because of connection problems going through the mountains, but I heard much of this, and this was amazing. So many thanks to Frank and Mary for doing this. Frank offered this to 50 Plus some time ago. I'm so pleased and appreciative that we were able to pull it off. I want to thank all the participants, both from Holy Trinity and beyond, and just all the great questions. And I loved the personal touch that you guys were able to bring to this with in doing your research. Just fascinating, and cannot wait to see the film. And we didn't put Dennis in there intentionally, but yay, Dennis. Again, this is fantastic. Thank you all so very much. And again, if you want to join 50 plus group, it's terrific. We do a lot of great things. Jim Fesson will put up my email, I think, if he's able to. So you can just send me an email if you want to get on the email list, and you'll get updates on. There we go. And then of course, further information on the documentary is here as well. And so on behalf of Holy Trinity and 50 plus, thanks so much.
And thanks to you, Linda. We're so happy to be here.
Indeed. Okay. Success. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It was fabulous, fabulous,
Absolutely.
fabulous. Mary and Frank, it was wonderful.
Good
Thank
job.
you.
And thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Pam.
Yes.
Thank you. It was terrific.
Thank you from Cincinnati.
Thank you,
Good.
Mike. Okay, Mike.
Thank you for this. Real treat.
Yeah, yeah.
So, man,
It
bye.
was really, it was wonderful. And Frank and Mary, I send you a big snuggle.
Thanks.
It's one of my Jesuit classes.
Yeah.
Frank and Mary, thank you from Frank Butler. And you look at Pius XII, Humani Generis, 1950, said there's no conflict between evolution and the Catholic Church.
Ah, good to know.
Well, I would qualify that, Frank. He was very cautious about that. And he said there were qualifications to whether that was possible or not.
Okay,
For a discussion for another time.
another time. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. It was wonderful. Terrific.
Okay.
Thanks, Frank.
Farewell, all.
Mary.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
So long.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Frank and Mary. Really
Thank
cool to see you. That was marvelous.
Thank everybody for being here who came.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There's Ellen Scarrett. Hi, Ellen.
Is everybody else gone?
Jim, can you put the screen back to Zoom? Jim, that's there. Yeah.
You turn off spotlight.
Gallery view.
There we are. Whoa.
So I'm holding from Cincinnati too.
Who's your sister?
So,
Caitlin.
Hey, Jim, how many screens did you have up there? Did you know?
I was in the
Fesson?
70s.
You're on mute, Jim.
It was over 70, I think. Yeah.
Good.
Jim's on mute, yeah.
Jim, you're muted.
There we go. There were 84 people at 7:45. I should say 84 screens, and
Hey,
a number of screens had more than one person. So I'm sure we hit over 100 people who were participating in this.
excellent, excellent, yeah.
It's cool.
And since it's being recorded, it will go up on the YouTube page, and it'll get a lot of hits, I think, up there as well.
Yeah, we have about 20, 25 additional people who couldn't make it tonight and asked for the recording. So
Right.
I'll send it to them.
We see that Jacqueline Francois is on the Zoom, and she let us know today. Jacqueline has been responsible for the landscaping of Teilhard's grave for years up in Hyde Park. And the cemetery has been shut down with this facility for quite a while. But
Because of COVID.
because of
Oh,
COVID.
Jacqueline, I want to thank you personally because it was years ago, what, couple of decades ago. Frank and Mary know this story. Dennis and I were up visiting the site, And we got permission they unlocked the cemetery for us, and I went in and the grave looked awful. And I didn't even know that Teilhard was buried there. And I'm going, oh my Lord, look at this. So I'm weeding and I'm digging and I'm trying to spruce it up. And so thank you very much.
And Jacqueline's let us know that they're about to open it up again. I think it's in June. I'm not sure, but
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Another pilgrimage.
Yep. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening, okay?
Thank you
You
all,
too.
everybody.
See you all. Good
Uh,
luck.
So Jim, do you end the meeting or do we just sign off individually?
You can sign off individually. I can end it, I'll see here if I can.
Bye, Catherine.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us, Kate Linehan.
I saw John was on there tonight.
Hi, Jenny. Jenny Vinton's there, hiding in the shadows here.
Yeah, right.
There she is.
Jenny likes the dark. And that was John Howard. He's written several books, right?
Hmm?
John Howard.
Yeah, John Hott. Yes, he's written a number of books.
The book club went through a couple of
Yeah.
one of his books.
Yeah, he's got 2 new books coming out too, so stay tuned.
Mhm.
Good work, Frank and Mary. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Pam and Dennis. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
If people
We're
wanna
still
give you a-
recording, Jim.
Okay, I'll kill the recording here.
Yeah, we've been
We
recording
can
for the.
really be, you can trim the recording.